Okay, so I want to establish a basic health management system. The convention for player management, health management, game management, we typically use these manager objects. We can combine these managers into one object, and it can get kind of complex. And for that reason, I'm going to break this out as we're introducing the concept into a simple health manager, or a player health manager to be a little bit more specific. And we're going to do this using an empty game object. And the reason for this is that we're going to use an empty game object by choosing game object create empty. And we'll call this, I'll do the long form name of player health manager, so as not to be confused with if we're managing the health of some other object on screen. This is an empty game object. It's equivalent to a null object in 3D modeling. And if you look at the inspector, you can see that it just owns a name and a transform component. Of course, we can add other things to it, but it's an empty object that has a position in space. And what we can do is we can attach a state machine with logic to it, so that this object just kind of sits inside of our scene and runs and audits our scene and runs whatever logic is attached to it. And the reason we want to do this on a separate object is if we were attaching our health to our rigid body player, our first-person controller, there may come a time when we want to swap out our first-person controller with another kind of a controller, or maybe we want to deactivate the object, or maybe we want to destroy it outright. In that case, any logic that's attached to that object will be destroyed along with it. So the player health manager is just an empty game object that's going to sit in the scene that we know is going to load when the project loads or the level loads, and we know it's not going to be destroyed unless for some reason we decide to destroy it. So it's going to be there inside the scene constantly running, and this will allow us to activate and deactivate our player character. It'll allow us to keep track of any kind of persistent data that we want to track throughout our game. So this is kind of a standard convention. So one thing to note about empty game objects is that if you don't have them selected by default, there's no visual reference to them. It's only when they're selected and I have, in this case, the move tool selected that I get a sense of where it's at. Now, it's not important in this case that I know where my player health empty game object is, because we're not really concerned. As long as it's inside the scene, we're good. However, I kind of want to use this to orient my player, or just kind of have a point of reference for when I start. So if I happen to kind of be over here somewhere and I get lost, if I double click on my player health manager, that will take me back and frame really more or less the kind of starting point or the spawn point of my map. So just want to note that I'm going to kind of keep this over by where the player spawns, only for the sake of helping to orient me when I get lost. But I like to move these up towards the top of the hierarchy, put managers at the top, and that's just a convention that I like to use, because that way I can look at the top of the hierarchy and find my managers. I'll also eventually probably group these if we have multiple managers, but for now we'll just focus on just the player health. So when I have this empty game object, the first thing that I'm going to do is add a state machine to it by going to the Playmaker editor, right-clicking, and adding a state machine. Much like the pickup cube, we're going to have a state that's pretty much in idle. We're going to do a couple of different things with this, but I'm going to start off with an idle state. Now my idle state, its job is to track a bit of data for the player health. So we'll establish a data type and some data that we'll use to measure and affect our player. So we're going to establish, I'm going to suggest a float variable we'll use for this project. And we've talked about variables in class. Just really briefly, if I go over to the variables tab, there's lots of different variable types in here. A float, we're talking about a floating point number, so anything with a decimal point in it. An int, we're talking about a whole number. Bools are true, false, bits of data, and we got to have valid data types. Depending on their use, we want to use them in a certain way. We got to have a compatible data type. We talked about strings, that strings are interpreted, that are alphanumeric strings of information that are interpreted to be read, so we can do things like input a username or read information off of the screen. But in the case of player health, I'm going to suggest that we use a float variable. Now, whenever we build variables inside Playmaker or inside Unity, Playmaker gives us this choice to build a local variable, which is if I go to the variable tab and I were to create a variable, I'll just call this local float as an example and hit return. I now have a variable called local float. It's being used 0 times right now. Its data type is a float. If I look down here, it tells me its name, its current value, and then a few other options here. This is a local variable, meaning that the only time I can access this local float is when I have the player health manager selected. That's the only way I can access this bit of data. So in other words, if I go to my pickup cube and I go to variables, you'll see that I have no variables listed here in this state machine. It's because variables by default tend to be local. Local information makes them more efficient. I'll go back to my player manager. Now, however, there is another type of variable, which is global variable. And there's a little button down here at the bottom of the variables tab, which is a shortcut to our global variables window. We can click on that, or we can go to the Playmaker editor window and we can open up global variables. So either way, we're doing the same thing. And this is just another window that's managing variables. Oops, I lost it. Let me go back to Health Manager, Global Variables button. There it is. And this is just listing the variables that we've established that are global. And right now we have no global variables. So we're going to create one. I'm going to create a new variable. This is going to be player health. Now we're going to have a couple of different types of player health. We're going to have the numeric value. In this case, we'll use float to measure and kind of quantify the value of player health. And then later we're going to print the player health to screen. So we're going to need a variable that can hold text, or we're going to need a string variable. So I'm going to call this player health float, or FL. I'll just spell out float all the way, just so that I can quickly identify its variable type. I'm going to leave it as a float, and I'll hit add. Playmaker lets me know that it's establishing a global variable, and we'll say OK. So now I have a player health float as a global variable. Now, a global variable we can access from any state machine. So in the case, the player may want to talk to its own health. Certainly the pickup cube, in this case, the model that we're building, will want to either add to or subtract from the player health, depending on what kind of pickup we design. And then, of course, our player health manager, we want this object to reference and kind of keep track of the value of our player health. So this is why we've set up a global float. So I'm going to go back to the idle state of my player health manager, and the first thing that I want to do is I basically just want some information that's going to allow me to take a look at the value of a float, because or the value of a variable in any case. We can skip this step if you want, but it's can be kind of abstract when you're dealing with data. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to this debug category, and the debug just really kind of shows us some data or some information or things that are happening inside our scene. There's some useful tools in here, and what I'm interested in doing is just debugging a float. Now, debugging the float is just basically going to return the current value of the float to screen, or at least to this window, so we can see what it is. So I'm going to choose the float variable of not local float. That was one that I set up for a test, but I want to see the value of player health float. And because I have this debug turned on, down here in this action, I can see that the current value of player health is set to 0. Okay, so that just kind of gives me some feedback. So when I'm playing my game, as long as I have the player health manager selected, I can look down in that state and see that, well, my current value of health is 0. Okay, so once I've established that, I can start testing some additional mechanics here. So if I go back to my pickup cube, my logic, everything is working. I have a collision event. If we collide with untagged, in this case the player, we can pass it on to the object being picked up. Currently it's destroying itself, but before it destroys itself, we could add to the value of player health, or that player health float. So what I'll do is I'm going to go look for the math category, and inside the math category I'm going to do a float add. I'm going to make sure that this add occurs before it destroys itself, because we do run the risk of destroying the game object before it has a chance to run the logic. So we're going to do a float add, and what that means is that we're going to we just need to satisfy these couple of parameters here. The float variable that we want to add to, we need to select it. So I'm going to, in this drop-down menu, I'm going to go choose. I'm going to choose globals, and I'm going to look to the player health float. The value that I want to add to this is up to you as the designer. In this case, I'm going to add 10. So every time we pick up a cube right now with this logic on it, our player health should improve or earn 10 more units of health. Okay, so I'm pretty convinced that that's going to work the way that I intend it to. So I'm just going to duplicate this cube by choosing Command D, and I'll make sure that I select my player health manager. And the reason I did that is because I want Playmaker to focus on the idle state, which is where I'm debugging the value of the player health float. I'm starting at 0. By the time I pick up these 2 cubes, I expect to have a health of 20. So we'll see if this works. So I'm going to wander over, and I'm just looking down the right side, looking at that debug value of my float variable. I've picked up my first one, and I see my health bumped up to 10. Picked up the second one, and I see that my player health float is now equal to 20. So that's kind of the core concept of how we're storing the data. I'm going to toggle the play button here. And that's just, again, I have an empty game object, which is player health. It has a state machine on it, which only has currently 1 state in idle. And I have an action of debug float, which is looking at the value of the public health float. The float that we created was a global variable, and you can get to the global variable window 2 ways. You can go to the variable tab of any state machine and click on the global variables button at the bottom, or you can go to Playmaker editor window and open up global variables here. By making that a globally accessible variable, we can talk to it from all of our state machines. We'll build out the health manager and print our health to screen here in the next presentation. But make sure that you get this core concept, this logic down, so that these pickup cubes are simply waiting for a collision, and when they get a collision, they'll pass it to a second state. That second state is improving the value of health, the global player health float, by using a float add. And then it's destroying itself to kind of clean itself up. We've already used it, so we'll make it go away. So make sure that you wrap your head around that core concept, and in the next presentation we'll kind of build out our health manager with a little bit more functionality, but we'll do that in the next presentation.